the whole I can't wrap my head around release evidence still, and it's been like months, and where issues play into that and some of those things. So
Okay, well, we'll start with the problem and the core issue to make
yep.
sure that we're okay with the approach that we're taking there, because that will be an issue that we're delivering next milestone. And then we can dive a little bit into how we're expecting this to interact with the issue summary and then with release evidence, because there's three different features there. There's the progress view that pulls in issues related to a milestone that's associated to the release, or uh, or in this case, they'll be directly associated to a release and they'll be pulled into the progress view. And then the issue list or MR list that's attached to the release evidence, which is created at the time of the release tag generation. So we can discuss all of that stuff. But
Cool.
on this first issue, we were doing some interviews with customers as a result of our release orchestration maturity scorecard journey when we moved it from minimal to viable. And a large piece that they were complaining about in order to leverage the release progress view feature was that they weren't using milestones as a part of their planning mechanism. Correct. So they aren't taking advantage of that feature. They're only using issues and the source code management work. So one thing that they requested was to be able to associate the release requirements that they have documented inside of issues to a particular release tag. And that's what this feature is about. It's about creating that relationship when customers aren't leveraging milestones. Future looking, there's a couple of triggers that we can create from this. Like, hey, we noticed that you're attaching a release to an issue. You know, you can plan releases with milestones. So how about you check out our milestones? And then there's even more stuff that we can do with, like, when people create group releases and using group milestones to track work across multiple projects and create indications and triggers inside the UI. But the heart of this problem that we're trying to solve with this relationship is to support the users that are using releases and issues, but not milestones, because we don't want to constrain people from releasing their code just because they're not using milestones, right?
Right. Yeah. And I think this makes sense for lots of reasons. Starting with the first thing, the UI proposal is fine. I think eventually we're going to move stuff out of the sidebar and into like widgets somewhere else in the issue, but like that's just another thing that you don't have to worry about that. Associating releases to issues makes a ton of sense for lots of reasons. So I think the only thing that I guess this is where associating a release to an issue, problem solved. Great, makes sense. I don't disagree with that. But then getting into the next tidbits of things, my next question then goes into when I create a release, am I creating a get tag, or like a get tag at that point? Yes. So forget release evidence. First thing is, yes, does it create a get tag?
Okay. Yes. So in today's world, a release is a tag with a release note on it. And it's a tag even when you generate it from the API. So it's just a version of a get tag.
Sure. Okay. So if that's the case, then you're basically at that point in time when the release gets created, you're creating a snapshot, a tag in the Git repo at a point in time that says, hey, here's the code at this point in time.
Exactly.
So then if you want to associate an issue to that at that point in time, I guess what I was asking is, you're associating an issue to a release that's already been tagged in the code base itself. So exactly. The assumption would be that all of the issues would already be completed in the code prior to the release being created, and then associated to the issue.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Right.
So they would go in like basically after the release has been done and all these issues are done and implemented, and then they would associate the tag to the issue to build the release evidence, because theoretically it's already all been done.
Exactly. So for people who are using releases as they're intended, which is this continuous, I'm tagging a release for every commit that I make on deployment, and my issues, there's going to be a handful of issues because for every commit, all of it's been done already. So theoretically, those are closed issues. They're just associating the scope that was requested with the release tag that was produced in production. We have an offshoot of people using a release tag So they create a release tag. It doesn't contain any code in it, but they are planning releases with milestones. So they associate that shell tag with a milestone. And that's where we get the issue progress view. And it's all those open issues in the merge request and merge request inside that milestone that are then assigned to that release that is like future facing. And then once that released date passes, so like the milestone is closed and that release is closed, the issues that are within that milestone should also be closed. There's no automation around that though, so you could technically have a complete release with open issues in it still, because there isn't any reconciliation there.
Can I just ask a question before we get too far down to this? In the past, a release is something that then is put in production, correct? Is that how we're defining it?
A release is already, in today's world, a release is a snapshot of your code in production.
Okay. Do we have a concept of baselines?
We have a concept of draft releases that we are going to be instrumenting in short order. And a draft release would be what we're hoping to deliver. And then that's where you use like your milestone associations to show future work. And then once the release is promoted or published, it's no longer in draft. That's the snapshot of production.
Okay, because in general, how I've worked in years past, and this is how a lot of the customers I've been talking to work, is they create baselines every time they merge. Effectively, if you're doing it correctly, you're creating a new baseline. The baseline or the final baseline will go into testing. When the baseline passes testing, at that point, it is considered a release. You may have multiple iterations of a baseline that don't pass and therefore are never released. However, those baselines need to be kept and the artifacts need to be kept against them, because baseline 7 may contain 50 issues. You find a problem in testing, you fix the problem under issue 51, you rebaseline. That baseline only contains issue 51. It's a culmination. So it's that plus one more. And then your release is these 4 baselines with these issues against each baseline. And your release is the final baseline, becomes your release.
I haven't heard of baselines before in context of release management at GitLab. Definitely have like in agile trains and safe and like that space whenever I was doing release management, like project plans and truing up delivery versus release. In my mind, there's like a clear line in the sand between plan versus delivery, and plan may have the baselines, but release is the production state. That is where we're expecting our version to be declared, which will have a Git tag associated with it and the chain of custody, which we're calling release evidence, attached to that. So there could be multiple snapshots of that release tag, which we're calling on-demand release evidence, which shows for each production patch that are released for a particular tag, there can be multiple chain of custody events to it. But that's all about delivery of a particular tag, not really the planning state and truing up what we've planned versus delivered. So there isn't a concept of that on the release side though.
Kind of map the terms that I'm accustomed to where you're going, because what a lot of the customers I'm seeing are requesting is they don't release to an application. They're doing embedded work. So they're releasing an executable file with CRC under a tag, right? They're then taking that, putting that in hardware, running all their testing external to GitLab. And if it passes, that becomes the release candidate and it gets released. What they need to be able to do is say, okay, I release version 1 to my contract, whoever owns my contract. And then 6 months later, I release version 2. And they want to be able to diff version 1 and version 2 from a tag diff and say, this is all of the changes, because this is the system level testing that you're now going to be responsible for performing, because we've touched these areas. And those areas are related to these requirements. The requirements trace these tests, and therefore these tests have to be run. Like that's what they're to do.
So future looking on release evidence, we have this idea of being able to diff those 2 chain of custodies within either a particular tag or between different tags. I think that baseline that you're talking about would be represented with our ability to compare release evidence over time. So yes. I feel pretty good about that. That's good. I'll send you some more links after that about release evidence. It's still a minimal feature. We had some things come out of it that we needed to go back and fix. So we have removed a bunch of stuff, and now we're rethinking how we want to contain all of the related artifacts inside of release evidence. And that work is happening this milestone. So after that, we should have more of like a richer release evidence chain of custody report.
Because a lot of the customers, now that we're doing requirements management to a point, a lot of customers are going to want to add requirements cover to their release evidence.
Totally.
So
Is this live on YouTube?
Yeah.
It is.
Oh, we're streaming this on YouTube. Sweet.
Yeah, I'm pretty lazy. I don't like to have to download then upload to YouTube. So usually I just stream them straight to YouTube.
Cool. So let's talk about future. I'm kind of working backwards. Like one of the things is like if in this first use case we talked about where somebody completes all these issues and then they're going to go add the release that contains all these changes that the issues requested basically. That's where I was thinking about it from the standpoint of you have your merge request. And the merge request should theoretically be able to determine which two tags it falls within, right? So if you have one tag that happens, let's say you tag your code on January 1st, then you tag your code on January 31st, the merge request, the time that the commit was made to the main branch will fall between these two dates. So therefore, if it falls between after the last one and before the next tag, that it's part of the next tag. So that's where I was thinking about. Merge request should be able to automatically infer which tag that they belong to because it's if you think about tagging just like a timeline, like where on the timeline that the commit fell.
I think the tricky part about this is that MRs have a many to one issue relationship, and then there's many commits that could be tagged on a particular merge request. So there may be any given commit that a developer could tag if they are producing tags as a part of their commits to master. And then those get deployed to production if it's like a CD world. So I'm a little hesitant to say that that's like a very clean inference, because you can have 5 merge requests attached to an issue and then thousands of commits. Of those thousands of commits, 10 of those could have tags. So there isn't necessarily a clean, we can always take the latest, and that could be like a clean, an MVP for us to say latest tag, and then that's assigned to the issue. But
yeah, basically what I'm trying to get to is the point where when you get to wanting to do your draft releases, you're going to want to say on an issue, instead of the use case of I'm going to go do it after the fact, I'm going to do it before the fact. And that's what I was saying is sort of like your target release and the comments is that. So if you were to say I want to do this at some point in the future, what the work that you want to avoid for the end user, and this is where I'm working on with iterations and milestones, automatically moving issues to the next one, that sort of thing, is being able to say this is when I plan for this, but this is the actual, release or the actual tag that this falls within. Or maybe if there's more than one merge request, here are all the tags that basically this issue is part of. The reason why that having that actual sort of important is because we eventually want to get to the point where when there is a defect that gets reported 6 months down the line, we can basically say, hey, it was introduced by this issue. This issue is related to one of these tags. So you can almost start to trace down where the bug or the defect or the problem or originated, and in what release specifically it did originate in.
So I realized something that I didn't tell you. Draft releases will be an object without a tag. So it's a pre-release, and it would be, you could then associate a tag with it after your production. So it helps tackle that second use case that we opened up with, which is users who are currently creating a shell tag and then planning to that and then re-tagging it after their release is done to production. And for draft releases, you would create a release object and then attach a tag to it later. So what we would see in the future on issues is that, like you were suggesting, having a target release in the sidebar, or it could say release assigned in the same option, whether that's a current tag or it would have an indication that's a draft release in the drop-down menu if it's a side panel option, and it would pull in releases without tags, and a user could select the draft release in that menu item so that you're still getting the issues to releases. So in the draft release world, pre-release world, they wouldn't have a tag that they're associating to. They'd be just associating it to a draft release. And then after the tag has been generated because the production release has been made, then that issue would get the release tag from the draft release that it was associated to.
Yeah, that makes sense, but that's also assuming that all of the merge requests, it's almost like since it's not being based on the merge requests, what happens when you have an issue that has merge requests that span multiple tags?
Well, in this case, they're having it depending on how users are creating a draft release and a production release. The draft release would be the highest level release, and their tag that they're creating would be their final push to production, likely from a branch, their release candidate branch. So it would be inclusive of all the MRs. And then that commit is the merge of that release branch into master, indicating deployment to production. So what we would be seeing is a representation of all the efforts that are included in that release, because it's like a monthly release with hundreds of MRs and issues.
Yes. So using this is one of my issues for adding aggregate counts, whatever, for usage being. And all the MRs that went against it, there was a ton of them spanning. So like, I want eventually this milestone can be like a planning object, but I want us to like have be able to assign the correct release of an issue based on the tag itself, so we can like dogfood that. But when I look at this and how we do it, so this overall issue, this change went out in 13.4. So it was technically within the 13.4 tag, right? This change went out in 13.5. So all these did within the 13.5 tag, one of the 13.5 tags. I'm not sure which one. And then this one is scheduled to go out in the 13.6 tag. So I have all these MRs basically that all are part of these different tags.
Yeah.
And
so each of those would be assigned the latest tag for 13.5. So the 13.5 self-managed release tag in our system would be the tag that's associated to all these features. Even though like .com is releasing continuously, we're not releasing .com on tags. So the tag that would be associated for our dog fooding would be the self-managed tag that gets released on the 22nd of every month for the corresponding milestone.
Yeah. So I get that, but there's 3 different releases. And so if you only can do one thing in the sidebar, do you just keep updating it? Or like, that's where I'm kind of saying, would you also then have to add the release tag to the merge request itself so that we can see that this merge request, like happened within the 13.4 tag and this merge request happened within the 13.5 tag? Do you see what I'm saying?
I think that there could be a many-to-one tags for an issue because merge requests have a many-to-one for an issue. Correct. So since each change is tagged in this case, and these are all related to the issue, we can have a series of tags on an issue. In the case of like this issue, since it's scheduled for 13.6, a person could have it assigned to a draft release in 13.6, and it could still populate other tags that this issue is for, given that it has MRs associated with it, because the changes are represented in 13.5's tag, but that's only partial for the issues being completed. So
correct.
It's a many-to-one relationship. I don't think it has to be. This is a requirement. It's representative of the scope that someone's delivering. The MR is the change and the tag is the snapshot of the production state. So we don't have to have a one-to-one relationship.
Okay, that's sort of where I was saying, like, I think that is one of the requirements is in the initial thing that you propose is that you can only assign one release to one issue. But in this case, would you, and this is probably my own education, since this change did go into 13.4, even though this issue wasn't closed, would you associate basically this issue and this merge request to the 13.4 release evidence?
So release evidence is very specific to the tag and the change, and the MR included in 13.4 would have a change log on it. And that change log would be included inside the 13.4 milestone. So that means that if the released at is for that merge request, the merge request in that particular tag will include release evidence of that issue or of that MR.
Okay. So, are you planning to add? How are we going to get release onto the merge request itself?
Not planning that yet. Today, it's going to be with milestone associations, and I think that there's more creative ways that we have to accommodate with how users are committing changes, and if they're tagging on each commit, or if they're creating monthly batch releases that are a series of MRs. It has to be flexible for how the user's release strategy works.
Yeah, I think that's the sort of thing. In talking with Matt Gonzalez a little bit, and talking with Mark on this call, his background is in highly regulated industries like aerospace, that sort of thing, which is why his language is slightly different than like the release train safe type stuff. So I've been learning a lot about that, but especially from like a compliance standpoint and a chain of custody standpoint, I was under the assumption that an auditor will want to know specifically like the chain of custody from a merge request to a issue to a tag in the state, like that is now like altering the state of production. So what was a request that requested the change? The merge request satisfies the change or whatever. And then that happened within a specific tag, and tying that together in a 100% like bulletproof chain of custody, basically. And so that's why I was asking the question, if we're not planning on adding that to the merge request. I guess the merge request, do you get what I'm saying? Like, how do we know if, for example, when you build your release evidence, what happened in which merge request and which tag?
So the release stat attribute inside of a release tag will be connected to an MR, which introduced the change to your branch, or it has a series of commits that were then tagged. So it's very much like the source of change is the MR and the tag that was generated in the current state. So it's like a very direct, clear relationship. We are enhancing the release evidence functionality to be more prescriptive in that once a tag is generated, it needs to list out all of the commits and their corresponding MR as a list inside of the release evidence, because then that's really illustrative of the branch and the changes that were introduced to production per commit rather than just per MR.
Okay, so all the commits will have some sort of tag on them, right?
Or an MR that is related to a tag, yes.
Okay, I'm just thinking because okay.
Because where customers are going to want to get to is they're going to see the diff between tag A and tag B. So release, X and release X minus 1. They'll have that diff. They'll say, okay, this line of code changed. What issue caused that code change? Why was it changed? And we'll need to be able to figure out a way for them to say, okay, that code change was done under this MR, which is part of this issue, which is tagged to this requirement, and that's why the code was changed. That's what they're going to end up, long-term looking for. The other long-term thing they're going to look for is group level releases, because they're going to say, okay, I'm an embedded controls engineer, and we have hardware, software, and firmware projects under a group called New Airplane Control or something. They're going to be baselining software. They're going to be baselining or releasing software, releasing hardware, releasing firmware releases. At some point in time, they're going to say, okay, we need to release this to our customer. In doing so, they're going to say, okay, I want this release for software, this release for firmware, and this release for hardware. And they don't always line up as the latest. They might go 3 layers back to get their firmware release because it's the last tested stable. So they're going to have to actually be able to pick and choose. And then they're going to bundle those together and say, okay, my formal release, and that's why we use the terms baseline, was baseline X for software, baseline Y for firmware, and baseline Z for hardware. And that is my formal release to my customer. And here's the evidence that goes with it. Now, I realize that that's not immediate, but that's where I'm getting a lot of questions from people is, how do I pick and choose? How do I get a firmware team that's constantly iterating and they're snapping releases once a month, once every 2 weeks? And we may want to use release N-7 when we actually roll up our release and send it to the customer. We won't want the latest. It's not tested. It's in development kind of thing. And that's where this gets really hard when you get into those types of industries. I'm not saying we have to solve for that now. I think we have a great start, and I'm really excited for where this is going. But I guess that's sort of one of the things that people are asking about. And right now, I don't know as though we have a very great story for how that's going to come to fruition.
Yeah, I would definitely say that release evidence is really weak in this case now. I would say it's still a very minimal feature,
Yeah.
and we're improving it to meet like our GitLab dog fooding requirements first. And I do think that
Good.
there's way more that we have to do to actually make it viable and usable for the broader regulated industry. I personally didn't build the original spec for it, which is why we're having to re-architect it, because I don't think it works as flexibly as it needs to, because not everybody is using issues and then MRs and commits and tags and environments in the same way. And one thing that we need to do with release evidence is show the chain of custody for a given point in time, and then connect that given point in time to tags that were released. And I think that allowing people to generate on demand a snapshot in the release evidence and then diffing those over time is really important. I also have other features like adding environments to the compare page so that people can see like production versus staging versus production a week ago, and comparing those states, kind of like a configuration drift, which might be useful for the more regulated industries that are looking to see what's changed in production over time.
Well, recognize most regulated industries don't deploy using GitLab. They don't use our deployments or secure defend. They use plan, they use manage, and they use this release functionality. And that's pretty much where their things stop.
And I think if they're using, so they're not even using CI, they're not building.
They're using CI to do building and linting and MISRA or other formal code checks. But the result of the CI pipeline is an executable that gets pulled out of GitLab and put onto embedded hardware. So any embedded industry, like a phone manufacturer, microwave,
totally,
they're producing software hardware that gets loaded onto something and then tested there.
One thing that Tim Rizzi and I are working on are better version dependency support, which is like, how do we support a distribution network with package and the releases page? And I think that is alluding to how can we support embedded software companies a little bit better as a distribution network, but also some of those pieces are like release assets and artifacts and persisting those assets over time, and then being able to integrate with external build packages and having them hosted and distributed through GitLab. Because of course you'll want to see like everybody who's consuming your binaries and the state of those binaries and like upgrade paths and all that stuff as a release manager for an embedded software company. So completely hear you on that, and really looking forward to making those improvements.
That's where we need to go, because I think where we've gone a lot towards SaaS, which is fantastic, but I think we need to recognize that the embedded market is very large with a lot of money, and a lot of them want to get off of Jira. And some of the things stopping them right now are the fact that we are very SaaS oriented and we're not incredibly embedded oriented. And I think the planning is coming along. You know, Gabe and I have been working really hard to get planning up to snuff so that people can use it for planning on these major, enterprise level plans. But I think it's great to see that we're also recognizing that we need to understand how to do things like release management and those things. And just having something out there shows our customers a lot that, no, we're looking at this and we understand that there may be a deficiency here for you. And this is where we're improving. Feel free to comment and contribute.
One of the things that I was going to say too, just about the circling back to just releases and issues and merge requests and that relationship that we talked about a lot before. Like this is sort of where I was thinking that it makes sense if you like what right now what you're proposing is working from the issue down, and then eventually maybe like tracking tags against commits and that sort of thing. But like the way that the tags basically work is you can create tags at any point in time. You can like basically create a tag to a specific commit, right? So there's like lots of flexibility, but at the end of the day, you can never have more than one tag on a commit, and you can never have like basically tags that are out of order chronologically, if that makes sense. So like in this case, we have like a bunch of commits, and then there's a tag that gets put on this commit that's 9fceb, which is right here, basically this update rake file. commit. And so you know that like that's the marker or the line in the sand. So anything that happened before that basically would be part of basically that happened between the point where this commit was tagged and the previous commit was tagged is part of this commit. So you basically can go from the commit to determine the version or the tag name, and then from the tag, like the commit to the merge request, then the merge request to the issue, to like basically automatically set where or what tags does this issue show up in, basically which releases, you know.
This kind of ties back to what I was saying before, that some people have different strategies of tagging their commits, and some people are also only they're committing to a release candidate branch, and then the way that they tag it is tagging the commit that pushes the release candidate branch to master, and then that gets deployed to production. So there's like thousands of commits in that release candidate branch, and the only tag that they create is at the end when they integrate that release candidate branch to master. So that's like, there's two strategies. You can tag each commit in your release along the way for each incremental snapshot, or you have a tag on the branch being deployed.
Yeah, but you still have the branch being deployed is usually main, right?
It's merged back to master, and that's what you tag. Yeah.
So that's still it. But when you merge it back into master, you're basically pulling all the commits from that other branch into master, and it's still going to be in chronological order with all the other commits in master.
The commits will, but they may not have tags on them, right? You don't have to tag each commit.
Yeah, it would only have a tag on the one commit that basically merges everything into that master branch, which
exactly.
Then there's still going to be a tag, like the tag's going to end up on the master branch, and you're still going to have a chronological list of commits basically on main. So you can infer what your main branch is, and then what all the tags are when they were put in, and what happened between them.
Yeah, which is exactly how like people are tagging in it with a shell tag and then updating the release with the new release branch tag. Like that's how it's working today, and that's why like release evidence has the list of commits and MRs in it after it's been merged to the main branch.
I mean, this is, we're working around Git limitations here and the way Git's structured. There's a reason that Git is not used in regulated industries very often. It's this exact problem is it's very, very hard to ensure that every commit is assigned to the correct version and gets attributed to the correct thing. And it's very hard to tee your branches in a regulated way where you say, I'm going to pick up version 1.0 and I'm going to make these 3 changes and release it as 1.1. Meanwhile, I'm charging forward on 2.0 that was pulled off at this phase, and 3.0 is on the trunk. And like it gets great, but this is one of those things where it just gets hard to manage. And I think this is why we don't see it used a ton in those industries, though it's gaining a lot of popularity. And I think tools like this and the work we're doing here will make it a slight bit more palatable if people can understand it better. But we are fighting the tool a little bit here.
Yeah, and it does make it a little bit challenging whenever I also speak to customers that are in, like on-premise applications that they're deploying to customers where they have like a license that they're promoting, and then they're making changes and updates and patches to a particular license because they have a binary that is inside that 1.2 version that's running on customer X, even though current version is 3.8. They have to like update all of the Spring files, or they have to like do whatever because these have, like they have a really hard time doing that in GitLab. They have to have like separate projects for each version, even though it's the same application.
Right.
Cool. Well, I think we're at a good spot. I'm totally on board with adding releases or tags or whatever you want to call them to issues in that way. And I think the next thing that I would love us to solve for, think through, is how do we get that information from basically a merge request as well. So either like the merge request would infer it from the issue, but ideally the merge request would infer it from the commits, which would then push it up to the issue of the actual. And then you have your draft could be like a target, or target could be the draft or whatever. Because I'm also want to build a better relationship between issues and merge requests, so that you do know that it's not just related, it's like literally implementing this issue. And if you do it that way, then the issue or the merge request would inherit things like the milestone, right? So you wouldn't have to manage the fields in both places. And I think that's from the pain point that I'm trying to solve long-term, is there's all these things that are on a merge request, these attributes a lot of them are the same on the issue. Why do we have them in both places? Because they get out of sync. People forget to update a label here based on the status, and then you don't know what the status is on the issue. Or if I change the milestone on the issue, then I have to go then and change the milestone in all of the merge requests. And like getting to the point where there is a single source of truth for where an attribute comes from and the relationship of like all of the things is sort of a long-term passion project of mine. So,
well, I love it. I know you and I both have connected a lot on how to make it easier to create relationships between MRs and issues. It's a hard problem to solve, but I have no doubt that we'll be able to get there eventually. So
Yep.
thank you. Thank you